Welcome everyone to the Utah League of Cities and Towns Town Hall around COVID-19. For the panelists who are joining us today, we have been doing at times up to 3 town halls per week since mid-March around all of the impacts of COVID-19. And we're excited to have a robust panel today to discuss a very important item, which is the next steps of the CARES Act. I'm Cameron Deal, the Executive Director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns, and I will introduce our panel in a moment as we will spend the next 75 minutes or so walking through the CARES Act. I should point out before we get started that there's going to be a lot of material presented today. We will send a follow-up email after, either later today or later this week, depending on how long it takes to assemble everything from this town hall, to make sure that you get all of the information that you need in addition to what we discuss in the town hall here. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box so that we can try to address them during the conversation. Otherwise, if we don't get to them during the panel, and then we will come back to them and reference them in the email that we send out afterward. It has been quite the tough week. We're still heartbroken about Ogden Police Officer Nate Lyday. We're still shocked by what we saw in Salt Lake City and other cities around the country. We're horrified by what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd. A lot to unpack in another setting. So wanted to acknowledge that it's been a tough week, but today's conversation is about the CARES Act and the next steps of the CARES Act. And so please focus your questions and your attention around what needs to happen around the CARES Act. With that, let me introduce the panel, and then I will get us underway. I'll take a few minutes to introduce the CARES Act. Then I'll turn it over to the League Director of Policy, Wayne Bradshaw, who has been our point person and liaison with the state of Utah and with Salt Lake and Utah counties around the CARES Act. We'll then turn it over to representatives from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. Phil Dean is the State Budget Director, and Duncan Evans is the State Budget Manager. Both of them are working on redoing the state budget literally as we speak. And so thank you for taking time today, gentlemen, to chat with us about the CARES Act. After the representatives from GOMB, we'll have State Auditor John Dougal, as well as Jeremy Walker, who's the local government manager in the Office of the State Auditor, who will discuss their role within the CARES Act. After that, we will pivot to talk about the 2 unique situations in Utah County and Salt Lake County. We're joined from Utah County by Josh Daniels, who's the Utah County Deputy County Clerk Auditor, and then Peter Brown, who is the Finance Manager for the CARES Act in Utah County. Then Salt Lake County was unable to send a representative, but both Wayne Bradshaw and I have chatted with them extensively, and they sent us information that they wanted us to pass along to the cities in Salt Lake County. And so I will present that information. And then again, with whatever time we have, we'll answer questions. Feel free to put the questions in the chat box as we proceed. So with that, let's get underway. The CARES Act, as a reminder, was the $2.2 trillion relief package, otherwise known as the third stimulus that the federal government, Congress enacted and the president signed back at the end of March. Since then, the League, the Association of Counties, the state of Utah, and other stakeholders have been working night and day to figure out how to implement it. Within that $2.2 trillion bill is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. The Coronavirus Relief Fund allocated $1.25 billion with a B dollars to the state of Utah for use by the state and local governments and to offset the necessary expenditures related to COVID-19. So our focus today when we talk about the CARES Act, we're really talking about the Coronavirus Relief Fund and not the rest of the components of the CARES Act. The bill passed on March 27th. Since then, the Treasury Department has issued several different pieces of guidance and frequently asked questions to try to provide some guidelines for states and local governments as we work to implement the CARES Act. The Executive Appropriations Committee met on May 13th, and the League's Wayne Bradshaw and Roger Tu testified to the Executive Appropriations Committee about the formula and distribution mechanism that the League and the Utah Association of Counties were presenting to the state for the state portion of the money. And then the Executive Appropriations Committee also wanted to discuss the situations in Salt Lake and Utah counties. Since May 13th, we've had dialogue with state leaders, culminating in the end of last week, finalizing the mechanism for the distribution of the state dollars, which is why we called the town hall today. The lead goal through this whole process has been to ensure that cities and towns of all sizes can receive CARES Act dollars in a simple and transparent way and can use that money for federally approved uses. That may seem like a relatively straightforward goal, and it is, but I'm here to tell you that in other states, it has not been this collaborative. So I applaud particularly state leaders and the county leaders in Salt Lake and Utah County for being willing to have dialogue with cities and the other 27 counties that did not receive direct allocations. If you were to go to some of our neighboring states, the state is actually withholding their entire coronavirus relief fund outside of the direct allocations and not sharing it at this point with local governments. We are fortunate in that the state of Utah, from day one, has expressed a willingness to collaborate with local governments. So let me talk about what that actually means before I turn it over to Wayne. The Coronavirus Relief Fund is $1.25 billion, of which up to 45% can be spent by local governments. So within that 45%, it's approximately 562 million, within that 45%, Salt Lake County received a direct allocation of 203 million, and Utah County received a direct allocation of 111 million. And that's because Congress determined that local governments with populations over 500,000 could receive a direct allocation from that 45% formula. It was not based on need or budget size or anything other than population. There were several dozen cities and counties around the country that received direct allocation. For every other county, in Utah's case, the other 27 counties, and for every other city, in Utah's case, all 249 cities and towns, they are eligible to utilize the state portion, and we were able to clarify with the Treasury Department that the cities within those two counties can also qualify for dollars from Utah and Salt Lake counties. The state pool for the 27 counties and the cities and towns within those 27 counties is approximately $247 million. That's where we will start the discussion today, is about that pool, and then we'll go to the Utah County pool and then finish with the Salt Lake County pool. So with that, Wayne, I'll turn the time over to you to talk about where we are and where we're going.
Sure. Thanks, Cam. As Cam stated, for cities and towns and counties outside of Salt Lake and Utah County, the state will distribute their $247 million based on population in 3 tranches. And with tranche 2 and tranche 3, potentially that formula population being adapted based on need or other information that we gather through this process. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the presentation, this is just an example. If you took the 274 million, broke it up amongst the population, that's about 175 per resident. 8750 would go to the resident if they live in a city, and 8750 would go to the county. 175 would go to the county for an unincorporated resident. Since we're distributing it in 3 tranches, you would divide that by 3. And as you can see here, this is just an example of how that money would flow. We're anticipating the first tranche will be in June. The second one will be sometime this summer, and then the last tranche will be in early fall. And again, the second and third tranche could be population-based or could be adapted somewhat based on other information that we learned through this process. Please note that this money can only be spent based on the law that was passed, the CARES Act, and the guidance that has been put out by the Treasury. To find that guidance, you can go to the Treasury's website and scroll down to the bottom of the page, and you will see the guidance for state, territorial, local, and tribal governments, as well as the frequently asked questions. The frequently asked questions are being updated regularly, so you'll want to refer back to that information. What the Treasury has provided is that you can spend it on medical expenses, public health needs. So if you are testing your employees, if you are testing the public, you can cover those expenses. You can cover employee expenses that are dedicated significantly to dealing with COVID-19, compliance costs, and economic support and revitalization. What you cannot do is use these funds for lost revenue, budget shortfalls, damages, payroll for employees that are not involved with COVID-19, construction projects, and expenses that your municipality may have contemplated already. So if you're going to make an improvement to your park that has a benefit to COVID, to reducing the spread of COVID-19, but you had already contemplated that, you should not use these funds for that project. Here's some further examples of what you can use these funds for. Like I said, payroll expenses, it's spelled out further in the frequently asked questions. If you're providing leave based on the Federal Family First Act, you can use these funds. You can use it for compensation. As you know, the state passed a bill extending workers' comp to employees impacted by COVID-19. And you can use these funds to cover those additional expenses, but only from March 1st to December 30th. While the state legislation contemplates past December 30th, these funds can only be used to that date. Grant programs and small business grants. One thing that we should state is that the Treasury is very clear that these funds should not be used to funnel back into your general fund. So if you do a grant program to help prevent evictions, homelessness, help people for emergency needs, you should make sure that these grant programs do not be utilized to pay for property taxes. Again, we will provide all this information in a follow-up email, but make sure that anyone that is signing for these funds from the state or either of the counties, that you review the Treasury guidance and frequently asked questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Wayne. Between Wayne and I, we've now given the general overview. So now let's start talking about the specifics about how these dollars are going to flow and what the expectations are of local governments. For that, we'll start with GOMB. Phil, I'll turn it over to you and Duncan from here.
All right, thanks, Cameron. Thanks for the opportunity. Again, my name is Phil Dean with the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. I'm going to provide a couple high-level points and then turn to Duncan that he can walk through some of the detail in terms of the allocation and how that process is going to work. One of the points I want to talk about here initially is that for the portion of the funds that came to the state that are being allocated to local governments, at the state level, we have very significant concern that we're directly on the hook for that. So as we make those allocations, even though we're not directly spending the money that's happening at the local level for this portion of those funds, we're in a real sense very much on the hook. So we care about this. I'd say we care about allocation of all resources from the federal government that go to cities and counties, but especially on this, we're concerned about it because we're on the hook in a much more direct way. And that's why we've wanted the auditor involved in this process up front. We want to make sure that we're all aligned in understanding that we're required and responsible to comply with that federal guidance, and so are you. And we don't want it to be an onerous thing, but at the same time, I feel like I owe it at the state level to protect us and what we're doing as these funds are allocated out. So it's important for you to not only read and understand the Treasury guidance as it exists today, but to read and understand that as updates come out every couple of weeks or so. They've been doing updates, and it was pointed out earlier, so I'm not going to reiterate that, but many of the things that these coronavirus relief funds cannot be used for, including revenue losses, right? I know there are discussions nationally and that may change, but as it stands right now, that is not an eligible use of funds. Another point I want to make just relates to flexibility. In all of it, both at the state level and at the local level, we're kind of learning this as we go, that there's no playbook given us beforehand how to deal with coronavirus pandemic, right? So we appreciate your flexibility and patience with us as we've worked through a few of these administrative issues. I think we've got those handled now by and large, or maybe a couple other pieces to work through. But we are to the point where we're ready to make allocations right away. That we'll need certain certifications that you're making to the state as you receive the funds. And with that, we are ready at this point now, having worked through most of those administrative issues, to act pretty quickly. One that I think we still need potentially some discussion on relates to the reporting process and how that's going to work. But by and large, we're ready to do that and can allocate funds pretty quickly at this point. The last point I want to finish with, as you think about your local allocation of the funds and how you're going to prioritize that, my sense is we're moving at the state level to the green risk level in the relatively near future. I don't know exact timing. But as part of that, some people think that means everything's going to happen automatically in the economy, and it's not. There's still a very significant issue of public confidence, consumer confidence that we need to be thinking about as we move forward. And I just invite you to keep that in mind as we start allocating these funds. What are the types of things that we can do to help instill consumer confidence as we move forward? So with that, I'd like to turn a few minutes to Duncan to walk through the process that we've set up.
Okay, so first, kind of want to point out the way that we think we can get this money out the quickest is using a fillable electronic form that you'll be able to fill out and sign electronically using Adobe Sign. And so we'll make sure we have links to that in a couple of places. One place that I have up right now is the GOMB website, and there's a separate page on there for COVID-19 materials. So in addition to some things like the Utah Leads Together plans and other materials for the public health and economic response, when we have the form ready, we will put a link up on our GOMB website. We'd also anticipate up on the Utah League of Cities and Towns website, they have a COVID-19 information page. So we'll make sure they have the information for the form posted up there. And then the actual form is basically going to be an Adobe Sign form. And the way it's structured is all of the information that you have to fill out and sign will be on the first page of the form. So it's basically structured that the first page is where you enter information and sign it, and then the rest of it is followed by terms and conditions for receiving the funding, and then the form will also have allocation tables for cities and counties. We'll list out all the allocations for the counties and the cities, and it will also be followed by the most current guidance and frequently asked questions from the Treasury Department. And then Wayne also referenced the page where that gets updated, and we have a link to that page in the terms and conditions too, so you can get back to that page. But basically, so a couple things to keep in mind for this form that we want you to fill out. If you want your money to be distributed quickly, one, we really want you to use this form. Even though, like, if you don't want to, we will give you options to download it and fill it out and scan it and email it to a person in GOMB. But if you want it quickly, fill out the form electronically and submit it electronically using the Adobe Sign. Two, as far as the payment method, we've worked with the state treasurer's office, and in almost all cases, they already have an account on file that they use to do your regular sales tax distributions. And so that account could be a PTIF account, or it might, as an alternative, be a bank account. And so if you have a PTIF or another account on file at the Treasurer's Office to receive other revenue from the state, if you check the box on the form to say you're willing to accept the money through that mechanism, it will be much quicker to do that. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, there's a box where you can check other. That means that will delay the payment because GOMB will have to work with the Treasurer's Office to reach out to you and confirm if you want a check mailed or if you want to provide another bank account or another PTIF account. But that'll take some extra time for us to, from a controls standpoint, to verify that that's an accurate account for your county or your city or your town, to make sure the money gets to the right place. And so on the form, you'll be able to indicate if your regular account's fine or not. We'll just need some basic information about the name of your city or county, your address, and then we'll also need you to provide the name of a contact person. And that's mostly going to be if you check the other distribution method, or if while we're validating your PTIF or bank account on file, if we have questions, or if we need to distribute additional information. For example, if the Treasury Department has updated guidance about something, in addition to sending that information to the League of Cities and Towns, we could elect to also send an email to those people who are the contact persons so they know about that updated guidance. And then, so that's the basic information that for that point of contact, you can put anyone you want in that point of contact. The final part of the form is a section that is the acceptance of the agreement by your city or county. And we want this to be accepted by someone who has authority to make sure that the terms and conditions are followed. And so in the case of a city, we're saying it can be a chief executive, so it can be a mayor. It can be a chief administrator, so that could be a city manager or a chief financial officer. And so we want in that final part for that person who certifies this to check that they've read the terms and conditions for receiving the money, and also that they're able to accept those, they're authorized and able to accept those terms and conditions on behalf of the city or town. And then they'll check that, and then when this is the live version, the signature block, you'll be able to click on it and it will do an electronic signature, and you'll be able to enter the name and title of the person who's certifying that. And then at the bottom of the form, there is going to be a submit button. And then what will happen is based on the email address that was put in for the point of contact, that person will automatically get a verification email with the copy of the signed agreement. And so that will be the quickest method to do that. And ideally we get that if there's a lot of technical information, that if it's a mayor or city manager or CFO, they might not have access to that. So the best practice would probably be, once you know who's going to do that, you should probably just make sure it's clear, like send to them, here's the form, here's the information for our city and the contact person. And that person who fills it out can be the contact person too, if that's the way you want to execute it. But that will allow you to give them the information so they can fill it out, because the way the form is currently built to save time and speed this up, it doesn't have a workflow where you could have one person fill out part of it and then workflow it to the next person and tell them to sign it. The same person did that, and we just felt that was the quickest way to get this out, because building a workflow, we'd have to use a more advanced solution and start getting into either like logins or other things like that for people to return a workflow. And we just did not want to do that, because the Adobe Sign was the quickest automated way we could do that. And so,
Duncan, can I ask you a quick follow-up question to that? So you said that when the form's ready, we'll put a link on the league website, which you're showing, and then you had the state's website. Can you go back to the state website so people can see where they'll be able to find it?
Yeah, so let's see. So it's
So they'll be able to find it.
gomb.utah.gov.
Perfect. Is the form currently available? Because you said a moment ago when we have the form ready. So is the form currently available, or will it be available in the next few days?
So it's not currently available, but we're hoping to get it up very soon. Let me see. So we have a draft that's almost final. We just haven't posted that yet, but it's not currently available. This case, and really the last decision, like everything as far as the background and describing who's eligible and the requirements and the timing of the payments, everything in the form is final and ready to go and basically ready to post. The only other thing that we're holding off on for this was the auditor's office is going to talk about the reporting requirements, and we think we're almost there with a solution. We just wanted to, on this meeting, kind of hear some of your feedback on that. But really, that once we settle the reporting mechanism, we're ready to release this. Everything else has been reviewed and vetted and ready to go. And best cases is we have the reporting finalized following this meeting, and we're able to post this tomorrow.
Terrific. Duncan, is there anything else that you want to add about the nuts and bolts here of the form?
Not really. It's kind of meant that most of it's still kind of like all the information that you need to provide. We've contained that in the first page. So that's really what you need to worry about, but you need to be aware of like all the other information that's either in the terms and conditions or one of the attachments from the Treasury Department. And so there is still a lot of reading, especially out of all this, the longest is at the end, there's the frequently asked questions from the Treasury Department. And that's the third iteration of that. And that's mostly coming off of they released it with the funding. And then similar to this call that you're having with the state, there's all kinds of organizations between National Governors Association, Association of like Comptrollers, Association of Treasurers, state like budget offices association, like all these groups all over the country over the last month and a half have had calls with the Treasury Department, always asking for clarifications on different points in the guidance or previous versions of the frequently asked questions. So that document's keeps growing and growing and growing with more information, where it's fairly comprehensive. And there aren't a lot of gaps left in the current version, but there's still a possibility that as you're reading that, that you might find some gaps. And if you find gaps and have questions, a good approach is maybe to reach out to Cameron or Wayne and ask like if they've heard anything. Like if you have a more specific question that doesn't maybe answered, it might be good to reach out to them and they might be able to provide some information.
Perfect. And to that end, Duncan, over the last 2 months since the CARES Act passed, we as a league have submitted several letters to the Treasury Department directly, as well as through the National League of Cities, asking for clarification. If we'd had this conversation, this town hall 2 months ago, it would frankly be a different conversation than it is today because of those FAQs and because of the guidance that's come forth. So thus far, one of the questions in the chat box was about additional updates. Well, I can't speak for UAC, but from the league's perspective, we have sent all of the updates to the Treasury guidance and FAQs through either our nightly email around COVID, Friday fax, and on our website. And so we've been providing that information. Then there were some specific questions, one about interlocal agreements and whether the interlocal entity and can receive the money, or if just the city or county can. And my understanding is that only the city or county mayor can be a recipient. There's also a question about issuing grants to small business. This is where you need to look very closely at the Treasury Department guidance and FAQs, because it does spell out what types of business grants could be eligible. So Robert Piles, that's as far as I'm willing to go on the call here without knowing exactly what you have in mind and being able to check it against the FAQs and the guidance. Then there's a question from Wayne Peterson about an employee who the local health department has to self-quarantine and if those expenses are eligible. The general concept here is necessary expenditures related to COVID-19 that were unbudgeted, and the FAQs and guidance actually walk through a bunch of examples of what payroll expenses would be eligible and which ones would not be eligible. So again, when we send out the email with all of that information, take a look at it to make sure it's consistent with the fact pattern you're presenting. So with that being said, a key component of all of this is the accountability. The federal government will be auditing everything at the back end, but they've made it clear when Congress passed the CARES Act that they wanted to get the dollars out as soon as possible, knowing that local governments and state governments were facing budget crunches. Cities like the state are finishing up a fiscal year this month and trying to budget for July with a lot of uncertainty and trying to reimburse for those necessary expenditures. So that, Auditor Dugal, I'll turn the time over to you and your colleague Jeremy to talk about the accountability provisions that will be part of the state $247 million.
Cameron, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. It's nice to know that Phil Dean cares about the CARES Act. So Phil, thank you for looping us in early on this. One of the key things I want to remind folks, as Cameron was just saying, understand your duty to comply with both the federal regulations and any terms and conditions the state or the county, whichever entity is flowing the money down to you. Make sure you understand your duty to comply. Second thing is just assume that you will have to repay any amount that you spent improperly. So understand that risk as you go forward. That's the importance of understanding the rules. Our experience is usually the federal government gets much stricter after the emergency than during the early stages of the emergency. We offer to the governor's office the use of the Transparent Utah website as a possible tool to help them review and track spending reports from the local governments. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Jeremy to kind of talk about a couple ideas of how that might be leveraged if that's helpful to the governor's office. Jeremy.
Okay, thanks. So I wanted to just give, this is going to be a little bit of a technical review of, so this will be a little bit, if it seems like an accounting lesson, I apologize, but I just wanted to show the details and emphasize that what we're proposing to facilitate this reporting would just be for those entities receiving the funds from the state directly, that those receiving funds from Salt Lake or Utah County would not be required. So this is not a new Transparent Utah system requirement. This is only related to these specific funds. So to facilitate that, we talked to folks at the governor's office as well as county and city governments with some of the different ideas that we had. And it seems the most efficient for all parties involved at this point is to use the existing Uniform Chart of Accounts style reporting that is already underway and reported to us quarterly. So what we're proposing is to add a new function code, and a function for most entities would be equivalent of a department. So you have a police department or a health department, those seem to be two areas that are highly impacted, that we would we'd create a new function code that would incorporate the 6-digit, each function code has 6 digits, and we would introduce this letter A into this new function code under general government category, which would be specific to the CARES Act. In addition to that, and I'll explain why in a minute, we'd also allow for any existing function code or department code in the Uniform Chart of Accounts, and this is a mapping that already goes on with every quarterly report that's sent to the Transparent Utah site, that any existing department could put in the second digit of their function code, they could put the letter A, because the only existing codes only have zeros in that placeholder. So they could just switch those over to A if they wanted to keep their departmental tracking as well. And so we kind of have two options. One is that you create a new function code in your accounting system and you start charging actual expenditures, wages, equipment, supplies, etc., to that department, or reclassifying previously charged things to that code. Or the alternative, and this is based on the conversations that we had with folks in county and city government, was they didn't want to be forced to create a department for something that would be relatively short term and have to live with those orphaned codes in the future. And that's reasonable and understandable. So we'll go through the solutions at the end, but I wanted to run through two examples of how using these two different methods would look in the reporting. So every Uniform Chart of Account number, it's three components: a fund, a function, and an account. And so the funds wouldn't change, the accounts wouldn't change, but we would introduce this new function, as you can see here. So one way to report the revenue from the CARES Act would be to add this function number, and for the revenue coming from that, this would be an example of an account code. So the account would be federal operating grants under the CARES Act function in the general fund. Alternatively, if this organization, say, had a health department and they had a department of communicable disease control, which is 400300, they could just maintain that and change the second digit to an A in this manner. So you'd have this Uniform Chart of Account number associated with that revenue. Both would be acceptable. One just falls under the general government, the other falls under the specific department that it already existed under. So more examples on the expense side. Again, general government, specific CARES Act function code, and for example, chemicals and testing, which is something that is probably taking place in many county health departments. That's the account code for that. Similarly, if you wanted to maintain the departmental code, the communicable disease control for CARES Act, you would just add the A to that second digit, again for chemicals and testing. And then finally, in the general fund, if you have a police or sheriff's department, again, they would have their own department or function code. And salaries, overtime is the account code, which we know overtime is allowable for those specific acts. Again, they would just put the digit A in the second placeholder and submit that to the transparent site, where it could be easily viewable and used for reporting purposes. So specifically, our recommendations, and I mentioned there's two different tracks. The one, our primary recommendation, and it's because it is the most simple, would be to add a new department or function to each local government's chart of accounts, create new accounts, and charge, reclassify, or going forward, classify those payroll or payables expenditures directly to those department codes. So again, the pros to that are, it's just like using the same as we've always done when we've introduced new departments or new account codes. The cons, as was pointed out before, is that those become permanent in your chart of accounts. Again, it's not the end of the world, but it can be a bit challenging to deal with going forward. So then option 2, which is allowable, would be to change nothing in the entity's chart of accounts, but still be tracking those expenditures outside of their chart of accounts, outside their accounting system perhaps, and then to go in and modify their Transparent Utah file that they would create through their accounting system, open that file before they submit it, and then manually or systemically change those function codes to match what they would have been and make them identifiable to the CARES Act. The cons to that is the pros are that you don't keep those legacy accounts for years in the future, but the cons are opening a text file, identifying and changing the codes is going to be a technical and a complicated process. One we will support, and we will provide help for entities to do that, but it will be a difficult and technical thing. It also may necessitate the splitting of a single transaction. For example, if an invoice to a supply company had charges on that invoice that were qualifying for CARES Act and some that were not, essentially the entity would have to modify their file and split that transaction in half, or add an additional transaction so that both the qualifying and non-qualifying portions of that purchase would be reflected. So we will be providing support for how to go through and open a text file in Microsoft Excel, give some examples on how to make those edits, and then resave that file in a format that can be submitted to the system. Again, it's not going to be easy, but we will support it, and that's something that we're willing to do to facilitate this level of reporting.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeremy. Auditor.
Cameron, the key ask is, well, these are two ideas of how to tackle this reporting and maybe leverage Transparent Utah to help facilitate that. We clearly, in the governor's office, clearly want some input from folks of whether this is reasonable, makes sense, or whether there's something else they'd like to do in terms of that reporting requirement back to the governor's office.
Terrific, and I appreciate both of you making that point. And I appreciate GOMB has not yet put the form online until we got this piece squared away. So the request for those of you who are participating in the town hall today is, if you have feedback or preference between those two, or potential other option, is to respond immediately to the auditor's office. Jeremy, do you want them to contact you directly, or how do you want the feedback to flow?
I don't know, it's up to Duncan. I mean, we kind of handle the technical things, but as far as the policy decision ultimately is with the governor's office.
So Cameron, I think first thing is thumbs up, thumbs down on whether folks would like to leverage Transparent Utah to help facilitate this. And then if it's thumbs up, then we can work with folks on some of the technical details to help facilitate that. And if it's thumbs down, then the governor's office can take that information and figure out a different strategy for getting that reporting.
If I could just add, if it's thumbs down, that probably means more time to work through some other process to be able to, we need this worked out before we allocate the funds.
Right. Perfect. Well, let's do this. I want to make sure that you're getting the feedback from the people who actually will be submitting the forms. So rather than asking for the feedback right now during the call with the audience, we've put the ask out there, and then let's get feedback via email to Wayne or me or to Jeremy this afternoon with final feedback that then we in turn can share with the auditor's office and the governor's office, that we can get this final piece squared away so the money can start flowing. Jeremy,
yeah, Cameron,
does that work for you?
Yeah, Cameron, if I could maybe suggest that you and Wayne consolidate all that all the entities circle back with you, and then that you can reach out with our office and the auditors.
Is that your way of trying to save Jeremy some emails?
Yeah, Jeremy and Duncan, just knowing everything.
Yep.
Certainly
yep, that's easy. So,
and Cameron, the key question is Transparent Utah or not. And then in the Transparent Utah, what Jeremy just showed is two examples that folks could do right now today that we can support either one. So we don't have to choose between the two scenarios Jeremy provided. We can leverage either way folks want to do that reporting and facilitate that for the governor's office. So it's really Transparent Utah, and if so, did what we present as two options sound reasonable either way folks want to go, or not Transparent Utah?
Terrific. Terrific. Well, that's helpful information. So again, those of you who are participating in the call, please send a quick note to Wayne or me, or make sure that your finance director or those who are interacting with Transparent Utah provide us with that feedback so that we can get the ball moved down the field on this one. So thank you to the auditor's office, and thank you to GOMB. Any other, Auditor Dougal and Phil, any other final comments from the state level before we pivot to the county discussion?
I think just the last thing I'll say is that we took us a couple of weeks to work through some administrative issues. Once we can work through this reporting issue, we are ready to get this moving very quickly so that, by the end of this week, funds could be going out.
Perfect. And that's really the key here is we're trying to get the funds out this week, and particularly compared with cities in other states who may not see any CARES Act dollars. We're very pleased with the fact that by the first week of June, money will be starting to flow for the 27 counties and the cities within those counties. Auditor Dugal, anything else from your office?
That's it. Stay safe. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much to our partners at the state level for their assistance with the state pool. Now we're going to pivot to talk about the other two direct allocation pools, the Utah County pool and the Salt Lake County pool. I mentioned at the outset that the key principles for the league, as we've been lobbying on the CARES Act, was to have a simple formula, transparent formula, and also an equitable and fair formula. We wanted to ensure that cities, regardless of where they were able to receive resources from the CARES Act to meet their necessary expenditures. There's been a lot of back and forth with state leaders, county leaders in the two counties, city leaders in those two counties, and city and county leaders in the rest of the state as we've been trying to get there. So Utah County does have a slightly different approach than what the state just described. So for that, I will turn it over to Peter Brown and to Josh Daniels to talk about the Utah County approach.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Cameron and Wayne and the league for hosting this. This is really great. You guys always do such a great job of creating resources for the cities and for local government. We really appreciate collaborating with you. Thank you. Yes, Utah County received direct allocation similar to Salt Lake County. The same principles and same rules and guidance essentially applies. Utah County is then directly responsible from an audit perspective to the federal government for the expenditure of those funds and for any disbursement. And so Utah County is going to be taking actually a similar approach to the state where we're finalizing an agreement, kind of a sub-grantee type of agreement that we'll be entering into with the local municipalities within Utah County, and then be dispersing funds through kind of a process and a formula that I think is going to be very similar to what Salt Lake County and the state is doing. Initially, we were sort of discussing the ability of doing kind of a reimbursement program where cities could just submit their expenses through a system and then receive reimbursement for those, and that we would just basically cover any and all of the covered expenses. Given some of the recent shift, if you will, in guidance or clarification through a recent call from Treasury, we actually think it's probably going to be more convenient and useful to just essentially proactively send a check to localities and then have in place with our agreement documentation requirements that will collect expenditure reports and those kinds of things. Of course, the obligation of any local government entity to the state in terms of transparency reporting on the transparency site where all of our transactions are uploaded, and sort of the always obligation of being a good steward of public funds, those all still exist and apply whether there's a reimbursement or a direct allocation. But the details for Utah County cities specifically actually are going to be hammered out this week. We have a meeting that all of the mayors have already been notified and invited to. If for some reason that was missed, please let us know immediately. But this Thursday of this week, we're going to be having our commissioners, Tanner Ainge, Bill Lee, Nathan Ivey, they're going to be meeting with the mayors of Utah County and hammering out the specific details of how the county is going to go about dispersing the funds to the various municipalities. There's some questions, some kind of key approaches that we could take. There's a couple alternatives that are going to be discussed, but generally speaking, we're looking at essentially the same general model that the state and Salt Lake County was going to pursue. The expense reimbursement plan initially that we had proposed, it's probably not going to be exactly that. It's probably going to be more like a sort of just a direct allocation. that's just going to be a little bit easier to administer. So that's kind of the general guidelines that we've got. Peter Brown in our office is the finance manager for this project specifically. Not only is he a resource to county government, he's a resource to all of the cities in Utah County. So if any city has specific questions about what qualifies and what doesn't, if they need any assistance or guidance in reporting, he's going to be a resource for all of the cities. And he's going to be helping to collect the documents and required reports from an audit perspective, in the event of any sort of future follow-up from Treasury. So that's what we've got to share with you. Peter, maybe if you'd like to just introduce yourself a little bit more, and if you have anything additional to share.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to do a little bit on kind of what we're looking at as far as reimbursable versus not, but that was really covered in the first presentation. So I don't want to go through that other than just to let everybody know that we have had meetings last week with several of the city administrations in Utah County, and we will continue to have those. I'm available one-on-one as well as we kind of work through this. Like Josh said, we did initially promise every city we do it 100% reimbursable, and that was what we stuck to initially, but there may be some shift in that. And so as we get more guidance from the Treasury, we just keep, trying to figure out ways to make this more in line with kind of that ease of getting the money down to the end of the row, so to speak.
Terrific, Peter and Josh. Thank you both. A couple of quick follow-up questions for you. Josh, you mentioned an upcoming meeting with the city mayors within Utah County. One thing that we've noticed, and this is just part of the fun of trade organization that represents 249 cities and towns, is that Wayne may talk to the city manager in one city, I may talk to a council member, you may talk to the mayor, and that was in part why we were trying to bring everything together for this town hall so that everyone was on the same page. So you mentioned that your meeting will be for the mayors of the cities in Utah County, and when will it be?
Oh, sorry. I saw you unmute, Peter. I don't know if you want to take that one. Yeah, it's going to be Thursday. Peter, do you have the exact time?
Hold on. I don't have the date in front of me, but it's right here. It is at 6 p.m. and it's at the Utah County Convention Center. They're on Center Street.
Perfect. So I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Oh, one more thing.
Go ahead.
They're serving dinner.
Go ahead before I put words in your mouth.
I just want to say they're serving dinner, so there's an enticement there.
Well, I'd hope so if it's a 6 o'clock meeting. Otherwise, that would just be cruel.
Yeah.
So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, despite what may have been indicated before, at this point, Utah County may be following the mechanism and the framework that the state has created, which would be a population-based allocation for each city. At the state level, they're contemplating 3 tranches. At the county level, at least for your first distribution, would be population-based direct allocation to every city and town within Utah County. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, Cameron. Yeah, and it's a great point, right, about the idea of the 3 tranches. Utah County recognizes there's some different ways you could do that. You could do 3 tranches. You could just do 1 tranche, all 3 in one. And just depending on some of the needs and what makes the most sense. I think, so those are some of the things that are going to be discussed on Thursday. But yes, very similar to what the state is looking to do. Yep.
Perfect. One of the questions in the chat box was around the dollar amounts for every city, town, and county. That information is on the league website. We'll be sending it out as well based on the analysis that Wayne presented in his presentation. Wayne, is there anything that you want to add just about that underlying data that we're using?
Yeah, just simply, if you break the 45% that's available to go to local government, It's about $175 a resident. Like I said, we gave half to the city and half to the county. So you can kind of do your math for your own city, but we also have those numbers available as estimates for everyone if you'd like to reach out to us. And like Cam said, we can provide that data in a future email.
Yep, and that analysis is consistent with how Congress allocated the money to the state. So we were trying to keep the formula simple, population-based, follow along with the initial allocation with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, with the recognition that as the year goes along, we may revisit some of those dollars as we look at hotspots and see what happens around the state. So Peter and Josh, anything else either of you would like to add from Utah County's perspective?
Yeah, so the first presentation where you guys went over your understanding of what was and what was not allowed. If you could give me a copy of that, I want us to make sure that we're comparing notes and we've got everything included that you've got, and if you want mine, vice versa, that would be fine too. So want to make sure that I'm coordinating that right.
Terrific. Wayne, I'll let you follow up with Peter on sharing that information. Terrific. Josh, anything else you want to add for the Utah County cities before we pivot to Salt Lake?
No, just looking forward to talking on Thursday, and thanks again for keeping everybody in the loop and putting this together.
Terrific. Well, thank you both, and thank you for the time you spent with city leaders over the last couple of months during this unprecedented time. Let's talk then about the cities within Salt Lake County. And again, if you have other questions, feel free to post them and we'll get through them as best we can. I'm looking here at one of the questions, a couple of questions that I just referenced about Utah County using the population formula and whether it be fully dispersed and be a liability until expended, or can the entity be requesting a certain amount up to the proportional allocation. This is one of the discussion items from the past few weeks. So once the city has the amount in your bank account, you can spend it on those approved expenditures. But if you don't spend it on those approved expenditures, or better put, if you don't spend it on the necessary expenditures consistent with the federal guidelines, one objective that all of us have is to make sure we spend the full $1.25 billion rather than sending some of it back to Washington at the end of the year. So when I talk about Salt Lake County in a moment, they're actually building in a provision to their contract with cities to address this policy issue. And this policy issue will be discussed as the year goes along with the state of Utah, so we can see how the dollars are going to be spent. So put it in layman's terms, let's say Cameron City gets an allocation based on my population of 4, and the allocation is $1,000. Let's say we only spend $700 on necessary expenditures consistent with the federal guidelines. At least in Salt Lake County, and the discussion at the state and Utah County levels have been that there would be a provision for that remaining $300 that Cameron City hasn't spent that could go back in the pot for other communities to utilize. If I use the full 1,000, that would be taken into consideration as we get into the year for the additional distributions. Wayne, is there anything else you want to add on that before I jump to Salt Lake County?
So I will say that the state also has a provision in a draft contract I've looked at. They have a provision where if you don't have a plan or have expended your resources in November, you have to provide either return those funds or provide a plan on how you're going to expend them by the December 30th. So it looks like Duncan jumped back in and he can probably address that as well.
Yeah, I'll just confirm that. I should have mentioned that I think, well, that was in the draft and anticipate that'll be in the final, that our cutoff will be November 30th, where either you spend it or you submit a plan to say, we haven't spent it yet, but we're extremely certain that we'll spend it on these things. So we know that we aren't going to leave any money on the table.
Terrific. And where this gets complicated is that today is June 1st. We are 10 or now 11 weeks into the COVID crisis. Nobody's exactly sure what the next few months will hold. And so there's the need to cover the expenses in the current fiscal year. There's the need to cover the expenses in the next fiscal year, and also to prepare for potential worst case scenarios that could happen later this year. So that being said, Wayne, let's jump back to the PowerPoint so that I can review what Salt Lake County shared with us. Their finance team is preparing an updated budget for the county council tomorrow morning, which is why their finance team was unable to join us. But they did send a letter that we will send with our email, and these were the 9 major points. In addition to walking through the necessary expenditures and those requirements that are consistent with what we've discussed thus far, here are the 9 major points from their current letter. First, city chief executive must sign. So it's the state, you heard Duncan reference, and it could be the chief executive or finance director, or there's a little bit of flexibility who that could be. The Salt Lake County language contemplates just the chief executive. Second, the deadline would be October 1st, or have a plan in place for spending the funds beyond October 1st. I should mention, actually, let me stop here before I finish walking through these 9. The key point is that Salt Lake County will be allocating directly to cities in Salt Lake County and to metro townships according to the population of those cities, an amount that's equivalent to what the first tranche would be if the state were allocating money to those cities within Salt Lake County. So roughly speaking, Wayne, how much money is that in the aggregate for the cities within Salt Lake County?
It's about $37 a resident for the first round of funding. So
perfect. So the Salt Lake County cities, the spreadsheet will show you how much you would receive in this distribution, and then we'll have the discussion with Salt Lake County about additional distributions as the year progresses. So I've mentioned the first 2. Number 3, the city must adhere to current or future federal guidelines. Number 4, if the federal inspector general determines that the city spent the money inappropriately, then the city is liable to repay the federal government and potentially the county government. Again, this is a similar provision that you'll see in the state document. The reason it's a little bit different, and Utah County, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but the reason it's a little different for Salt Lake County is that Salt Lake County is on the hook for these dollars. And so the county wants to ensure that if the city spends the money inappropriately, that the city is liable back to the federal government. If the city cannot pay and the county thus is forced to pay, then the county can then recover those dollars from the city. Number 5, if the city receives funding similar in purpose to the CARES Act, then the city must repay the county. This is worthy of future discussion with Salt Lake County because of the dialogue in Congress right now about a potential 4th stimulus, and not sure exactly what the 4th stimulus will ultimately hold. But I don't know if that means an additional CARES Act or if it means any sort of federal funding. So we'll need to work through that. Number 6, the city shall retain documentation of the expenditures. That's pretty self-explanatory. Number 7, the city must post the uses or subgrants on a website or medium available to the public. So this would be the comparable to the Transparent Utah website that the auditor's office referenced earlier. 8, the city must provide a monthly report to the county. And 9, the city must agree to other standard contractual terms between the county and the city. So again, we will distribute that letter when we send the email with all of these CARES Act documents and information out in the next day or so. But that is the message from Salt Lake County. Again, the primary takeaway is that every city in Salt Lake County will receive an allocation according to population comparable to the state formula, and as Wayne indicated, be roughly $37 a head. Wayne, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I missed.
Sorry, go ahead, Wayne.
It's about $29.
Okay.
Was too generous.
Yeah, $29. I went to law school, not math school, but yeah, 85 divided by 3, that's more akin to 29. So with that being said, there are a few more questions in the Q&A. Wayne, is there anything else you want to add from policy perspective as I pull back up the Q&A?
Nope. But again, it's very important that everyone review the Treasury guidance documents, because that's what will ultimately you'll be held responsible for. So.
Perfect. So a question from Quinn, hope all is well in Vernal, Quinn, where you talk about the definition of substantially dedicated. So I had somebody say to me the other day at the state level that they felt like the Utah Leads Together plan was going to be interpreted like scripture. Some people would interpret it one way, some people will interpret it another. I think you've highlighted an example of where there's a term of art within the guidance and the FAQs. And really the underlying principle is, can you justify it as a necessary expenditure? And are you willing to justify it to the Inspector General down the line? What you've outlined there makes a lot of sense to me, but ultimately it's going to be, will you feel comfortable making that justification there? Robert, you asked a follow-up question about the guidance and FAQs being silent about PPP recipients. So if a business receives the PPP, could it then also receive a grant from the Coronavirus Relief Fund? So everybody knows the CARES Act itself was over 800 pages. The Coronavirus Relief Fund was 1 page of the 800 plus pages. The guidance and FAQs have increased our understanding of the Coronavirus Relief Act by 20-fold, and yet there are still some points that are silent. So again, I would say the same principle applies. If you do proceed to use your Coronavirus Relief Act dollars in a way that's consistent with the guidelines, that's not revenue replacement, but for necessary expenditures, if you are issuing grants and they've received PPP, I think you just need to work through that and determine if you think it's consistent with the intent of the Coronavirus Relief Act. Mary Beth Thompson asked about sending the scenarios. Yes, we will be sending that information out. I got Mayor Peterson's question from Leeds. Hope you're staying somewhat cool down there. Nick Hales, does the local government need to have filed the FEMA application? No, that was something that came up when the bill was first passed, what the overlap would be with FEMA. And my understanding is still that you do not need to file FEMA. Then Quinn, okay, I mentioned that one already. And then will we be able to get a copy of the recording to this town hall? Yes, Kim, we will be posting it on the website after it is uploaded, and it will be in the email that we send out. And then Ricky, I don't know if I want to give Ricky my email. I'm gonna have to think long and hard about that one. But that being said, I'm happy to give you Wayne's email. And Wayne's email is wbradshaw@ulct.org. And in fact, I'll just type it right here in, and I'll give you mine as well. Okay, perfect. So there are the emails that we just posted. So those are the questions in the chat box as of now. Wayne, did I miss any that you saw?
No, and we'll make sure and go through these and follow up with anyone that.
So Wayne, I'll let you take Joanna's question about the about replacing state funding that may be withheld by the legislature. Joanna's asking for some friends, and since she's a friend of mine, I'll say she's asking for me so that you can answer.
That is correct. None of these funds can be utilized to replace any lost revenues or funding shortfalls. It can only be used for direct COVID-19 related expenses.
Perfect. And then Brian Rogers and Zeke Lee from UAC also posted their email addresses so that you can contact them directly. Brian at uacnet.org, Zeke at uacnet.org. So Ricky, you can reach out to your UAC colleagues. Lynn, nice to hear from you. Have you posted that list of Sully County requirements? We will be posting them. We got the letter from them this morning to share with the call here. So we'll be posting them in the comprehensive email we'll be putting together. So stay tuned for that. Okay, I just posted the other email addresses. I think that is everything. Oh, Peter, terrific. Thank you for posting your email address for the Utah County cities. And since you've posted that, we'll also include that in our email. And we'll make sure you have the contact information for the folks in Salt Lake County as well. With that, Wayne, any final comments from you?
No, thank you for everyone's participation today, and watch for more information.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Happy Monday.